Okay, today's presentation is the first of probably 4 parts, and it concerns my presentation of ancient Greek technocentric warfare. What I'm going to argue in these 4 parts is that there was a development, there was a quantum leap or a step up in threshold in terms of military fortifications, defenses, particularly city walls, as a result of the emergence of offensive weaponry, particularly projectile firing machines. So you think of catapults or ballistae, but torsion-powered projectile firing machines that ultimately, by the time of Alexander the Great, could throw round shot of stone weighing as much as 50 to 100 pounds against walls from about 200 meters away. So it's the repeated impact of these stone shot on stone walls that forced communities, city-states, to improve their defenses to withstand this new development. And I'm arguing that in terms of offensive weaponry, this development did not occur until really about Philip, the era of Philip, and then we're going to follow it through from there. So the first step today is to look at examples of archaic Greek and Persian fortification systems, what existed prior to the advent of this technology. And then next lecture will be the development of the technology. What is the evidence we have that it's in use and it's in place by the 4th century BC? And again, what I'm going to show and what I've been trying to focus on in my own work is material evidence, not just text, but the material evidence that these firing machines had come on board and become relatively commonplace. And I believe that that was achieved by 350 BC. And that's what we're seeing. And then the third step is how Philip and Alexander and the Macedonians were able to make an offensive weapon, siege trains, taking them with them on assaults for the deliberate purpose of besieging cities. And then lastly, in the Hellenistic period of the generals, particularly Demetrius Poliorcetes, where did that go? All right, so that's kind of the parameters. I hope to do this in 4 parts. I hope to keep the parts relatively short, so we've got to get moving. And here are some examples of early fortifications. And when I mean archaic, I mean before the Persian Wars. You might think of it that way. So before 500 BC, generally. And we're looking at different fortifications here. In all 3 of these cases, these are the defenses of an acropolis. So what I mean, the easiest thing to defend in terms of its distance, its circumference, would be an acropolis. And we have the Acropolis castle, the medieval castle at Argos to the left. We have the fortification walls of Corinth above on the right, and below just a small place, Hyzea, but it was the site of the first hoplite battle in 669 BC. So it's momentary, significant for that reason. What we see in all 3 of these, we've got different kinds of stone construction. And what we're looking at here is the stone masonry, the style of stone cutting. And all of this is limestone, which is a sedimentary rock, which is a relatively soft rock to quarry and to dress and put in place. And what we see here, you got 3 different styles, but if you look at each one, especially at the bottom of the Argos, you can see those big stone blocks that are irregularly, what we would call polygonally dressed. Same thing, we've got a very smooth dress wall in Corinth, but there at the bottom, the courses, the arranged rows, piles of rocks, courses at the bottom, you can see that same irregular cut blocks, large blocks, polygonally dressed, and the same thing more or less with Hyzea. And so first step we can say is that probably pre-existed the walls that went above it, and they represent the foundations of the earliest surviving citadel walls of these places. And probably what we would call this is a socle, a stone foundation on which sun-dried brick or earth or wooden superstructures will be put on top of it. Invariably, these walls are, say, 2 to 3 meters thick. They could probably go up at least that high. So we're talking about something that was 3 to 5 meters tall. The most complex example, undoubtedly, are the Great Walls, the Long Walls of Athens, for example. We have a lot of descriptions. The problem is these walls were remodeled repeatedly, even in the classical and Hellenistic periods. So it's really hard to say, here is something that dates before, say, the 4th century BC. But if we look at the fortification walls at the southwest end of Athens, the Keramikos, you can see in the construction the survival of these same kind of large polygonal blocks. Now, it's complicated. They clearly were reused in one of the slides right here. But that suggests the same thing, that the walls of Athens originally were a circle of these big blocks and then baked earth or sun-dried earth, brick on top of that. That's kind of what Thucydides describes, especially for the long walls, this 6-kilometer corridor, 2 walls 200 meters apart that extended from Athens to the Piraeus. The description we have is that they are generally 2.5 meters to 3 meters thick, and supposedly they were as tall as, say, 10 meters, 30. Now, towers are mentioned. Thucydides actually mentions that when they pulled the population in from the city, the people would set up tent villages inside the long walls or camp out in the towers, just squat in the towers. So we have to allow that there were towers. Towers in this era, as we'll see, were primarily platforms for archers, and they project in front of the wall so that you can see back along the wall and fire back at people who might be trying to undermine it or storm it with ladders. And those were the two options you really had, is scaling the walls or undermining the walls in this period, because the weaponry to actually take down walls really did not exist. If we go over to the Aegean side, now we're in the Persian side of the Aegean world, Greek cities, but under Persian control. And we have some really significant examples of fortifications there. The most significant, probably the biggest fortifications of this era, are at the ancient Lydian capital of Sardis. These walls, again, by the time of the Persian conquest of Sardis in 546, the main wall in most places was at least 10 meters tall, 10 meters wide. So could have been maybe 50 to 60 feet tall as a wall. And then in some areas they added an additional front wall and made it as wide as 20 meters. So we're going from 3 meters to 20 meters thick. We've got a really tall wall constructed of stone and earth, kind of a combination of the two. We're looking in the lower left at the actual Acropolis. And what we know is let's go to the next slide. What we know is that when the Persians took over Sardis, they basically expelled the population. The population had lived inside the walls. And they were expelled outside the city, and the entire city, the excavators like to call it, the city turned inside out. It became a Persian administrative center for the satrap, but also as kind of a garrison town. The garrison lived inside the city, and it was a treasury base. The Persians could bring bullion here for the satrap to pay his troops and things like this as well. So anywhere you got stored treasure, you got to have very, very strong defenses. And that's what we see. This photo is from the Roman era Palaestra Gymnasium looking up at the Acropolis. And here are the remains of the walls. They were found about 20 years ago, and it brought this whole revelation about the city turned inside out. You can see a reconstruction there, and that's actually showing the remains of what appear to have been siege ramps, maybe how the Persians took the city. Here are the remains of the wall, and here we get better cut stone. These are smaller blocks. They are, at least the faces are dressed in such a way that it forms a uniform surface. But if we look at the ramparts, again, scale of this wall, very significant. If we look at the ramparts, though, what we see is these are clearly just platforms, platforms for firing down at the enemy. And I have the famous Altenkuch sarcophagus portraying one of these Phrygian aristocrats on cavalry fighting a Greek slinger. And it kind of reminds us that the local aristocracies sort of bought into the Persian hegemony and became part of the Persian military. Some other examples in the same area. So Sardis, somewhat inland there behind modern-day Izmir. North of Izmir, there is the ancient city of Phocia, modern-day Foggia, and it has some remarkably dressed walls as well. Let's go to this one. These walls have been excavated, and the pottery, and that's what we have to go by for dating, is you have to have some sort of context pottery. Usually foundation pits is where we count on, but you got to find that, and that's a pretty lucky thing. But what we have here in this one end of the wall is this remarkable sloped wall, this what we would call a glaggus, or a sloped front to the wall that serves as a buttress to the wall, but it also makes it kind of difficult to undermine it or to scale it at the same time. And again, this appears to have dated to before the Persian conquest of this city in 546 BC. In this case, we get very nicely dressed stone. So we shouldn't be monolithic or orthodox about this. We shouldn't think, okay, it's all the same. No, stonemason really depends on the talents locally and maybe levels of urbanism, what kind of schools exist, or it could just be because we know that, for example, the Athenians can build magnificent temples of very, very fine dressed limestone, but the city walls seem to have been kind of slapdash, so maybe it's a matter of cost and time. Temples, bear in mind, can be built over centuries. You can dress those stones very slowly and prepare them at a very slower rate. Walls have got to be built rather quickly, maybe within a year or so, because of the existence of a threat, an imminent threat. Just another example, one of the great things about Phocia is just outside, not very far from that stretch of wall. Here we have the remains of a tomb with a fire altar, what appears to have been a tomb of a very important Persian noble, if not a satrap, certainly a Persian noble, that in its design imitates the great tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae. Kind of remarkable, one of the many, many instances we have of this sort of Persian footprint in Anatolia. Another one close by, Larissa, I only point to this one. There are various walls going on, so different eras, but the main wall that's interesting is this, what we call lesbian masonry, this very, very fine polygonal block masonry, very well dressed on the surface, on the face, as you can see, and all those blocks are sort of irregular and deliberately designed to fit together in an interlocking manner. In a way, the puzzle-like formation of the blocks might even have helped to hold it in place. Just south of there, though, if we go down to the Erythraean Peninsula, we get to the city of Colophon. Another city, we are told, was stormed, first by the Lydians, and then later as well. So it was stormed in the 6th century BC, and there are remains of fortifications there that seem to date to that era, in addition to later remains. And I'm trying to focus on, right now, earliest remains that we can see in this regard. And in the case of Colophon, we get what we would call is a ring wall. So a circuit wall that is linear, but it is curving. There are no kind of angles to it. It is about 2.5 meters thick. And what we have here is just piled up rubble, piled up dry rubble, really just immediately undressed quarry stone, probably banged right out of the hillside behind it and thrown into this pile to create a circle on which baked earth or wooden structure, superstructure could be put on top of it. And again, no evidence of towers here is one of the real pivotal things, which would make a problem if you were on the ramparts. As the wall turns, you're going to have a limitation of view as a defender. One of the things about towers, it projects in front of the wall and gives you a view back that way. And there are various ways you could counter this curving problem, the vision problem, but we don't need to discuss that right now. Okay, now we're going to move from the Aegean coast way over to the south coast of Turkey, due north of Cyprus. We're going to move into my region, the area I work in, Cilicia. And we're looking here at an offshore island. There it is, Dana Island, ancient Petusa. And what we are told is that around the same time, around 556, a local king, Apuwashu of Perindu, kind of built a naval empire. From this coast, he was sailing across to the shores of Syria and attacking states allied with the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And so in 526, 527, Neriglissar, the Babylonian emperor, led a big razzia down here, chased Apawashu up to his fortress in the hills. We'll look at that in part 2. And then destroyed several of his locations, including he had to storm a naval force that was on this island, according to him, some 6,000 men. And then he marched all the way along the south coast, all the way to ancient Salinas. So it was kind of a demonstration of strength. Apawashu never got captured. There's evidence that his family continued to persist in the region. He's one of these kind of local mountain warlords, you might think of it that way. But he did have some 5 or 6 that we've identified of these ring forts, these stone ring forts in the area. And that may explain this naval hegemony of his. So close-up of Pithusa. I misspelled it there. And on the southern heights of the mountain, it's an island about 3 miles long, and it has this spine, goes up the middle of it, gets up to about 300 meters in altitude. You can make out this kind of pentagonal fortress at the top. With our drone, we were able to identify not just one, but we have 2 fortresses. Now, the one in the foreground is a little ring fort, just round, and then in the distance is the big one, which is about 300 meters across. And then there's a saddle between the 2, and there seems to be a natural road that led up to the top of the mountain right there in that saddle. In the Byzantine era, they actually built the stone way because the distant high fortress became some sort of a sanctuary with a basilica in it. And so it seems to follow the natural route if you were going to try to get to the top of the mountain. So we got these 2 ring forts that seem to be protecting the way up in a kind of minimal manner. Okay, here is a view of the main citadel. And you can see the fortifications. And again, it's about 2.5 meters thick, and it's just the same kind of dry rubble piled up. You got big blocks creating the interior and the exterior face with a lot of rubble in between. One of the great things for us is that as part of the fill, what we say be the stuff you put between the 2 faces, we found a lot of broken pottery, pieces of pottery, thrown in to help fill the wall. And the pottery was datable. And what we have here are these what are known as basket handle transport jars or amphoras. We've got the handle and toe of the one on the left, and then the handle, which I have argued is this big one on the right. The big one dates between about 700 to 600 BC. The little one is later. It's sort of 5th to 4th century BC. So we're in the classical era with these fragments. Same thing with this amphora, kind of remarkable. We found several fragments of what appears to be an archaic Chian amphora of the early 5th century BC. I'd say before 450 BC. It's either Chian or it's imitation of a Chian. It's kind of remarkable. But they have same thing has been found in the local museums. So it was available in this region. Chian was a very expensive wine. That's what we're told by Aristophanes in the 5th century BC. So we can put this ring fort, both of those ring forts, pretty squarely, say early 5th century, right around 500 BC. Not far enough back maybe to match the date of that battle with Neriglissar, except that you got that one big amphora there that would date to that period. But maybe it just continued in the Persian era to be used. And just as an example, a little bit further west, all the way, you can see my cursor, Hamaxia, it's way over on the eastern end of that map. Excuse me, the left-hand side of that map, western end of that map. There's another ring fort, kind of an interesting fort. It's just outside of Alanya, called Hamaxia. Again, originally a ring fort that people added towers to, and then an interior tower, which you can kind of make out in one of the photos, for purposes of artillery. What we're told is Hamaxia was famous as a place that people brought down cedar wood to the shore. It's right above a harbor. It's right on the hill just before the water. And cedar was very valuable for shipbuilding, for planking, because it was rot resistant. And so this region was famous for its cedar. Hamaxia means wagon place where wagons move. So place where they brought down cedar maybe with wagons. And here we get a close-up of the walls. Okay. Now, what I'm arguing, I don't have the pottery to prove this, is that this is a Persian era installation, maybe 4th century. Why do I say this? Because it is now the blocks, as you can see. I should point out this wall is only about 2.5 feet, not even a meter wide. So it's just kind of a defensive wall. But it is about 3 meters tall. And it has a very weird doorway that's kind of archaic as well. The main thing I point to is 2 things. Now the blocks, as you can see, they are dressed in a rectilinear manner. It's not polygonal anymore. It's kind of dressed so that they can form pretty even courses, right? So if you can make them all the same, you can put them all together like Legos, and you can make it taller that way, and it will stand better. But it's not perfectly rectangular. They're not perfectly rectilinear. We can't call them ashlar. We can call them proto-ashlar, or there's various words they use. So that's one feature to this, and this shows that these are dress stones as the quarter just quarried round boulders that they're throwing into a pile. There's one transition that we can see. The second thing, though, is that you can see how there's like gaps in the stones, and so they've put in smaller stones vertically. What we call this is an interstices. In the interstices, they're jamming smaller blocks to fill gaps. Okay, so they haven't quite perfected, at least the stonecutters here, the idea of a nice ashlar wall with seamless joins. Joins are the lines, the dressings between the blocks that determine how well you can join them together this way. So it's kind of irregular, and you can see various problems. It's being done probably on site, and so they build it as they go along this way. And we don't have evidence of towers that match this wall itself. One of the reasons why I think this wall is significant is that even though it makes an advance and is probably Persian era, those small blocks would be really vulnerable to a 100-pound shot hitting it repeatedly. They would smash and pop out really quickly. And so that tells me that even this wall predates the advent of projectile firing machines. Okay, so what can we conclude? I think what you've seen is that the caliber of the stonemasonry depended heavily on the relative state of urbanism. In other words, do you have trained stonemasons capable of doing magnificently finely dressed blocks, such as we saw at Phocia? There is really, really fine masonry put into the defenses that way. Again, there could be other reasons why they didn't do it to that fine degree. Time, cost. But nonetheless, we can see a wide variety of types that are all contemporary. These would have been in use at the time, I think, of Alexander's conquest. Secondly, note the use of massive, poorly dressed polygonal blocks at Athens, Corinth, and Argos. Okay, that's an indication of maybe what they used for sockles in that period at the time of the Persian Wars. Third, most ring fort remains represent stone foundations, as I said, to support upper levels constructed of baked earth, sun-dried brick, or wood that is now gone. And so we have to always remember, this is simply a foundation, and the thing went up from there. Fourth, ring forts and circuit defenses were fairly common, but the lack of angularity in design would have impeded the view of the defenders, and you have to think about that. Cities under siege in that regard. Another point, there's minimal evidence of towers, and those that exist are relatively small. I mean, in terms of something that projects out in front of the ramparts, out in front of the palisade. They tend to be too small to have supported projectile firing machines. So towers did exist, but their purpose was other than what towers will be used for in the following era. That's why I argue that all of these fortification systems predate the emergence of projectile firing machines in the early 4th century BC. Firing machines, such as catapults, would have rendered most of these designs obsolete and would have required the development of new modes of construction, or you become captured and you become a subject state. And that's the one thing, as we know, that any city-state would have done its utmost to have avoided.